Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Kasey Robinson, a business development manager at Beyond Equality and an EDI consultant. Kasey, it's great to have you here with us after we've had some great conversations in the past. Could you please share with us what your DEIJ hot take is that guides your work?
I think I'm going to be honest when I share this, in that I wrote a hot take and then I questioned, is this a hot take, right? Like, where are we with the hot takes at the moment? And I think I'm going to lean on some of the original sort of things I wanted to say, but then maybe expand on it in terms of the way that I've reflected on it since.
Please do.
So what I wanted to bring forward in my hot take was really thinking about how we use the word inclusion or inclusive, and whether it was something that was really able to demonstrate what we were actually talking about, or whether this is actually just a conversation around what it means to do the necessary work to get towards inclusion, right? To go towards spaces being more inclusive, versus like the utilization of that word as if it's something that we've already achieved or is achievable in like a really short space of time. So that's my review on the hot take.
No, I like that. And I like already we're seeing the depth of your thought about these things. I must admit this consideration is quite close to my heart because the idea of the intellectual approach, the use of language, which for a period of time was only seen in journal articles, I think we do need to consider if it's being used properly. How deep do we go and how do we ensure it's actually impactful work? So what I'm going to ask from you is if you could take us through what going more deeply into inclusion means, why you feel that this is a hot take, and how do you make this a reality in the work that you do?
Sure. I think the easiest way to illustrate that is probably like through the way I actually do this work, right? And that comes in several different threads because I wear many hats when I do this work. And one of the core things that sticks out, particularly for that really kind of more, I suppose, broader focused EDI work that organizations look to do, is I introduce something called alignment sessions with them. And an alignment session is essentially a space where a particular team or certain staff members come together and we talk about language, right? Like there are words on the board, we go through the definitions of them in terms of that dictionary definition. We think about how that term is being used in that particular context or setting. And then we think about its limitations, the challenges for it. Are there barriers there? Are there opportunities that we haven't considered before? Are we using that word responsibly? Are we using that word as a marker for something? Are we using it to make sure that we're motivated and striving for better? Asking lots of kind of reflective and critical questions like that to really understand kind of what that journey looks like. But I think also when I say alignment is to make sure that people are aligned, you know, we all absorb and can kind of understand these words from various different parts of our lives, be it television, media, our work, our job, the books we read, things that we are just listening to. And so often you can maybe find there's some misalignment with what people think for certain, like what you maybe consider basic terms. And so if an organization is either working to develop that or to maintain that work, it's really important for me that there is that specific alignment in the work that they do. So a term like inclusion is a really important word to break down, just to really recognize the depth of it, but also to understand that there's a lot more there than just like the word itself, right? We're talking about organizational strategies. We're talking about, people development plans. We're talking about ways in which that we can move businesses forward and make organizations work better and more fair. And so there's just got to be depth behind a word like that. It can't just be something that sits there and we're like, okay, we're done now, So I think that's really key. And I think a second example I'll give to illustrate that is in the work that we do at Beyond Equality, which is working with men and boys, specializing in doing that. And I think there's often a frustration that can come through sometimes where people want to, for want of a better term, like throw everybody in a room and just work it out together, versus what it actually means. There's a lot more conversation quite literally in the past couple of weeks around masculinities in men due to like adolescence, which everyone's talking about. but what it means to really recognize what is going on with certain groups of people, right? Be those groups of people that occupy more privilege or not than others, and just not have the assumption that like putting everybody in a room together also means that it's inclusive, right? We've got to understand the needs of those people. We've got to understand the experiences of those people. We've got to understand their access or lack of access to resources, understanding knowledge, education, all of those things there. And so it's really about what it might mean to work with groups of men, which for some people can feel exclusive, right? Like you're kicking everybody out, versus what it actually means is doing the work with certain groups of people to meet their needs as best as possible, doing work with those other groups of people as well, maybe in similar, maybe in different ways, but then strategically understanding what it means to bring them back together, to then work towards a much more inclusive space where people have the tools, the resources, the confidence, the vocabulary to actually do that work collaboratively. So those are two examples, but that's sort of where my hot take's coming from.
Oh, thank you so much. And I love the clarity with which you've explained that. I had a question that I wanted to ask you, which was all about where people are on their journey, but you've really covered that. The idea of an alignment. I've also come across the language of creating a shared understanding, which basically meets everyone, makes sure they're equipped or arguably, although perhaps an over romantic word, but empowered to use the language, to use the actions in a way that everyone understands, but also actually has the meaning and the intention that everybody has, to an extent, agreed on. I could do a whole conversation or discussion with you about your views on separating people to create identity and advocacy. And because I really enjoyed how you described separating to clarify, but ultimately having the goal of bringing back together. So not separating like they should remain separate, but actually identifying what each group needs and then creating an alignment of all of them in an alignment session, perhaps, and then bringing it together. So thank you so much. Really fantastic stuff there. Where place I would like to go a step further with this is just asking, with these alignment sessions and with this ensuring the depth of the inclusion work which is being done and the intent of it and the desired outcome, have you ever experienced where there has perhaps been an over-intellectualizing of it, where people perhaps or organizations get so wrapped up in the language or having a deep approach? I think in some circles, people might use the word woke, but as a negative. There are definitely positive connotations to that word, but it is frequently used as a negative, where I think sometimes people are doing what we might call virtue signaling, where they're like, well, I'm using this word, therefore I'm doing this work. Have you ever come across that kind of over-intellectualizing of inclusion work?
I mean, I guess it's only fair to start with myself, right? I over-intellectualize everything. I have a master's degree from the London School of Economics, which is very prestigious and very fancy in the world of academia. And we were taught very strictly, and I listened very intently to the ways in which that we should stay true to the principles of academia. And then I came out of that master's degree into the real world, right? And was like, so no one speaks this language. What's going on? Right? Like no one has to do what I'm saying. Okay, this is great. I think one of my favorite academic writers is Bell Hooks, because she specifically talked about the way that she writes so that her, what I think was a literate mother, could read her work, and the way in which that she didn't want to wrap it up in this kind of fancy lexicon jargon piece of work that can often happen. I actually read back some of my essays and my dissertation, and I was like, I used to be that clever. Wow. Wow. You know, who wrote this? Yeah, I mean, it's completely over intellectualized in so many ways, not necessarily in every single space or in every single organization. But I think that this is, these are topics, should I say, that can be very divisive, right? For reasons that we don't have time to go into, or very difficult to address in lots of different settings. And so I think sometimes over intellectualizing it puts it in boxes that make it feel a bit neater sometimes. But the thing for me that's so important is, you know, remembering actually what this is all about and like the communities that this is essentially supposed to serve. And those are not communities that are going through like high level, purely white gate educational institutions. I'm like the first of my family to go to university. I don't come from a family of people who are university educated. And so also what it means to intellectualize like our own history, right? Like our own lived experiences. I lived with my aunt when I was doing my master's degree, and I was telling her the things we were reading, and she was like, "You can just go down Croydon for that." Like, what? How much did you pay? To talk about that. So it's about being really realistic, and I think I saw that happen. You see that happen in many ways, where you want to give a specific language to this work. You want to, how do I describe it? I don't want to say label it and box it, but I mean, if we look at terms like gaslighting, like
Yeah.
microaggression, like spiritual bypassing, right? They're
Mhm.
all really useful terms that label experiences that many of us who do experience marginalization go through each and every day. And we just sometimes don't have the words to describe it. We know that it's happening to us. We're
Mhm.
living with the impact of it, but we don't have that fancy word to say, oh, so and so gaslit me, or that was a microaggression, right? We're just
Mhm.
dealing with it. And so I think while that language is really important, there needs to be also a real critical reflection on terms of who can access it and what that means for them to feel, because you can often exclude the very communities you seek to include by over intellectualizing these conversations a lot. And so there's a deep, deep level of humility that's needed that I, try and employ as much as possible to remember, like, yes, that work is important, that research, the academic literature that underpins it, the data that sits out there, decades and decades of research, and all of that work is so, so fundamental, but it has to be translatable to
Yeah.
everybody, right? And that's
Yeah.
the work. That's what this is about.
Mm. No, I really love that. I've had the privilege recently of working with Darlene Fisher, who's got a PhD, which is all about communicating across cultures. And we did some presentations together. And this idea that a mantra that I like to say is that a rose by any other name is just as sweet. So it's not, the key importance isn't necessarily the language we're using, but our ability to communicate our experience, and then through communicating it, be able to challenge it, to change our reality, to make spaces more inclusive. But the language should never be something which either allows people to hide behind or prevents people from accessing that conversation. And you are definitely just as smart as you were when you were at university, because I've had exactly the same experience where
I promise
I've
you,
read
I'm going
back
to send
old
you a
things.
dissertation. You're going to be floored, Darryl. You're going to
No,
be like,
no, 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 no. I've read my old dissertation, and I was just like, Daryl, who's meant to understand this? Like,
yeah.
um, but with all of that being said, what for you would be a key takeaway for someone watching or listening to this right now that they might be able to mull over as they consider the next piece of work they might do to support inclusion in their community?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about community or workplace or space
Yeah.
work, there'd be a difference in terms of what that might look like. I think the reality around this for me is like the takeaway is like language, like mind your language, go back to the drawing board and think about the words that are being used and what they might mean for you versus what they might mean for other people across the organization versus what they might mean for people who are at entry level in the organization versus senior leadership in this organization. There's going to be differences there. And I think if we can't align on the language that we're using around this, we're never going to get to that work. So that would be my kind of key thing, is really just like make sure that it is as accessible as possible, but maybe not sort of in the most typical ways that we think about accessibility, right? Like education level is also a huge thing, and like just awareness and even like generation. A lot of organizations are doing multi-generational spaces these days as well, and that's a really important thing to consider too, how it lands with people who've been in the workforce for 30 years versus people that have been in 5. And so what it means to really have that kind of shared vocabulary together, so that when those bigger pieces of work come forward, people can get on board and people can play their part in doing that work together, versus just what can often be a bunch of confused looks around the room, or like okay, I guess
Yeah.
that's what we're doing.
And it's
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating when those confused looks, 40 minutes into the workshop, you say a different word for the same thing and they go, oh, yeah, that's what we call it. And it's like, we are talking about the same thing. But
Exactly.
sorry, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much, Kasey. Yeah, thank you for everything that you've shared. For the people listening, I'm going to place links in the description so they can find you and connect with you. If hopefully you can do some collaboration together, maybe explore your ideas and some of the work you've done. Thank you for watching and listening, and I will see you on the next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you so much, Kasey.